In this world, there are cars that you just can't believe were made. Sometimes I look at them and just think, how was this car even allowed to be made, produced, or just has idiotic flaws? And there's probably a few cars that you can think of immediately. Now, not to name a few, but this isn't just about the French, but there are definitely a lot of French cars that are pretty naff. And this could be in terms of their design, their build, and maybe just stupid things about the car that you probably just didn't even need to know or wanted to know. And as a result, I am going to bring you a great video on some idiotic, crazy car designs and flaws. Let's start with the French because it just seems super fitting, and with the Citroen C3 Pluriel arriving in 2003, which was an extraordinary car. However, this is a car that when you look at the concept should have stayed as a concept.
No! God, please, no!
Now, I just want you to picture this. When the C3 came out, it was a lifestyle choice. It was claimed to deliver 5 body styles in minutes thanks to its canvas roof mounted onto a pair of arches. But it's exactly that problem. The pair of arches were the absolute bane of this car. You could also have a comfortable 4-seat saloon with roomy boots or an open-top leisure vehicle. Now, the idea on paper was great. It also came with a full-length sunroof, a Targa-style semi-convertible with roof removed from the arches in place, full convertible with the arches off, or even a 2-seat pickup truck essentially with a load area. There's so many different versions you could make from the C3 Pluriel. Execution of the actual car was pretty shocking. Also, you didn't look cool driving a C3 Pluriel. The roof was perplexingly fiddly, the arches were a hefty 12 kilograms, and yeah, there's one problem with those arches I mentioned. There was nowhere to store them, as Top Gear also said.
I brought the roof, just to be on the safe side.
And they also mentioned that if it suddenly starts raining, you're screwed. And for me, the C3 Pluriel is the perfect example of a car that just should not have been made, but was, and somehow got past the design test. And I think that explains the French cars perfectly, so I'll try and avoid a French car for the next one. Screw it, I'm actually going to talk about the Renault Avantime, because to be honest, that is one amazingly awesome, weird car. They actually called the Renault Avantime the fabulous failure, and it's because it was such a great car, but also awful at the same time. One of those cars that comes out of France that we never have seen again from Renault. It was first unveiled at the 1999 Geneva Motor Show. The Avantime was conceived by the practicality of an estate car, but with the swooping pillarless looks of a coupe. Now, while it did succeed in doing this, Renault wanted passers-by to look at the car and be astonished, and frankly that is actually the case. It's still awesome. Description: it didn't have the dramatically raised roofline or the necessary flourishes. It did have the coupe's elegant doors and pillarless side windows, and moving inside the Avantime was a cool sofa looking interior. But the biggest issue with the Avantime was in fact its doors. It just swung so heavily on the hinges that weighed 56 kilos, and this basically meant that if you parked an Avantime facing up a hill, there's a very good chance you'd just not be able to get out of the Avantime. As probably you would expect, Renault had such trouble sealing their frameless windows that it delayed the car's launch and gave it a nickname past Avantime, the not before time, which ended production of the Avantime. It was a cool car that killed itself. And the thing is, the Avantime now is considered almost a retro future classic, and frankly could only go up in price. The Avantime, make no mistake, is a brilliant French car, while also being terribly overpriced, terrible design for the doors, and also a car that no one needed. The original X6 may not have appeared to be a stupid car, however when you actually look into it, it is very stupid by design. And it's because the X6 has an unusually sloping coupe roofline SUV body, and just saying that is probably enough to make you cringe. Now, while the X6 may have appeared great, this car, you've got to remember, came out at a time when there was a financial crisis in 2009, and the world didn't need this car. On top of this, it had a significantly compromising rear passenger and cargo space, and it was one of them cars that lacked form over function. Yet again, Top Gear tested this thing.
They call it a sports activity vehicle.
And the problem is, with its niche appeal and the financial crisis and the stupidity of design, meant that this impractical design for the X6 was a smaller market to people who really liked its looks over everyday practicality. Therefore, the X6 of 2009 was just not a car a lot of people bought. Not to mention at its time its 50 grand price tag, when frankly you could get a Range Rover for that price and be able to go off-road. I just think the X6 as a car, every time I see it, I wonder why people buy it. It seems to still, even today, have no place, but but I guess people do like that style now. It also ran super heavy on petrol, so you would have to be insane to buy one. I particularly like the X6 of this era because it came out at a time of financial crisis when the world wasn't buying cars like this. It still got a market share and someone bought these. While not being a particularly good looking off-roader that couldn't even off-road. But they have refined the X6 and it has since gone on to sell a lot better. And in some ways BMW were way ahead of their time. The Italians always make something that is absolutely crazy and doesn't make sense, and there is no difference here. The 1969 Fiat 500 Abarth. Now granted, this was 1969, so I think we can let this one slide a little bit. Just for reference, the Fiat 500 Abarth original was sold with a boot that couldn't be closed. And because there was so much power in it, this meant the standard Fiat 500 went from a car that was pretty plain and slow to a much faster, little lighter car. So basically the Fiat 500 Abarth in 1969 had to be sold with the boot open because the engine got overheated, and this car was hilariously small. You have to remember, adding more to this car just made it worse. But I do kind of give it credit for that cool boot lining. Does anyone remember the Mercedes A-Class? No, not the Mercedes A-Class of today. The original Mercedes A-Class was a car that was running before it could walk. And did you know that Mercedes lost 2.5 billion euros on this project despite selling 1.1 million A-Classes? That tells you all I think you need to know about the design flaw of the A-Class. This makes it actually weirdly one of the best-selling baddest cars of all time. And most of this in the A-Class came from its safety. Now, despite suspension, anti-roll bar steering and a fuel pipe safety issues, there was a main issue that I haven't spoke about yet. That was that this car had its infamous elk test, a swerving avoidance technique on a snowy road. This was to ensure that the car was safe when turning in tight conditions or dangerous conditions. The car somersaulted and ended up on its roof with this famous photo. It was a public relations disaster and more than 2,500 cars were made so far, so they withdrew the car and relaunched 3 months later. Now, while Mercedes did make changes to the A-Class, it never really changed the car, and the fact is, it was always known as this terrible handling Mercedes. Yeah, and as I mentioned, this car is nothing like any of the current lineup in the early 2000s. It just looked weird, the cheapest Mercedes by far, and people would try and get in this to actually own a Mercedes. And not to mention, there was a Mercedes A-Class van. The next car is the British Reliant Robin, and it was a car that on the surface seemed fine until you actually got in it and realised what a death trap it was. Now, if you don't know and you're not from the UK, it was originally conceived to be classified as a motorcycle with relaxed licensing rules. This meant if anyone didn't have a driving license but wanted to get about, they could just get in a Reliant Robin very cheaply and not have to have a driving license. Now, as you can probably tell, there were 2 issues with this. 1, most people didn't have any law of the road, so they didn't know what they were doing. And 2, the Reliant Robin in itself was dangerous because it pretty much fell over on any corner that you came to. And the flipping of the Reliant Robin was somewhat exaggerated because it constantly did it, and often multiple times. Now, luckily you couldn't do this at fast speed because the Reliant Robin wasn't that fast, but this did mean the steering wheel would pop off at times, and the car in itself was just dangerous. I don't think there was many in the UK in the 70s that weren't scratched or had an accident. Now, you might think today this is basically a tuk-tuk, and essentially it is just a more dangerous, faster tuk-tuk, and it's safe to say since then there hasn't been that many three-wheeled vehicles, and if there has, the 2 wheels have actually been at the front rather than the back, because with the Reliant Robin there was also no reverse gear. So you could say this car was actually a massive design flaw. Reliant Robin was actually pretty cool. It featured being half bike, half car to get away from insurance and tax costs. But I guess they never factored in that people would roll this thing 24/7. There are not many cars in the world that I hate more than the Chrysler PT Cruiser, and I think that goes without saying for the majority of the car community. But what is worse than the Chrysler PT Cruiser, I hear you ask? The PT Cruiser Cabrio. Specifically, the rear access of the PT Cruiser, which made it a monumental design flaw. The convertible version of the PT Cruiser was notable for its scuttle shape, which was once compared to that of a Morris Minor. The problem was that the seat belts in the position of the Cabrio prevented easy access to the rear. Now, we've all struggled to get into the back of cars when it's in a 2-seater. I think we've all been there. But anyone wishing to climb into the back of the Cabrio PT Cruiser meant that they had to push the belts down and climb over them, or scramble underneath. And I promise you that's worse than it sounds. The only other option was putting one hand on the side of the body and vaulting in, which was only possible when the roof was folded down. Now, when you did manage to do all this, you had to actually sit in the back of a Chrysler PT Cruiser. Now, I don't know about you, but sitting in the back of a Chrysler PT Cruiser, bear in mind looking like this, while on a sunny day, got to be one of the worst things you can do. And it even embarrasses me to say that when I was younger, I feel like I wanted one. But as I've got older, the PT Cruiser is by far the most tragic American car to have come to the UK.